The sleep began an hour before the burial and kept on through the whole of it, fine and gray and relentless, the kind of weather that works its way under wool and settles against the skin. Adele Voss stood at the edge of her husband's open grave in Greenridge Cemetery with her gloved hands folded in front of her and watched two men she had never met lower Raymond into the ground on canvas straps. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. She was 69 years old. She had spent 22 years on the bench in the state of New York, 11 of them on the appellate division. And in all that time, she had sat through testimony from men who had drowned their business partners in duck ponds, and from mothers who had burned down their own kitchens for the insurance money, and she had never once lost her composure in a courtroom. She did not lose it now. She stood very straight in her black coat with the sleet gathering on her shoulders like ash, and she said goodbye to the only man she had ever loved without making a single sound. Dean Keller wept enough for both of them. He stood on the far side of the grave in a charcoal overcoat that fit him the way clothing fits men who have it made rather than bought, dabbing at his eyes with a folded pocket square, his jaw trembling at all the right moments. He was 46 years old, broad through the shoulders, silver coming in at his temples in a way that photographed well. For 12 years he had been the junior partner at Voss and Keller Rare Coin and Bullion on Broadway in Saratoga Springs. And for 12 years Raymond had called him son when Keller was in the room and something cooler when he was not. At the graveside, Keller caught Adele's eye across the casket and gave her a small, wounded nod, the nod of a man sharing an unbearable grief, and something old and practiced in the back of her mind, the part of her that had watched 10,000 witnesses arrange their faces before answering, made a note of it and filed it away. She had met Raymond Voss when she was 49 years old and had long since stopped expecting anything from her life beyond the work. Her mother had died that spring in Utica, in the same narrow house on Blandina Street where Adele had grown up, and among the things Adele carried out of it was a King Edward cigar box half full of old coins. Her mother had kept it in the bottom drawer of the sewing cabinet for 50 years and called it the rainy day box, and Adele, who was then a trial judge in Saratoga County and had no idea what any of it was worth, brought the box to the little shop on Broadway with the green awning and the hand-painted sign because it was 2 blocks from the courthouse, and she could walk there on her lunch recess. The man behind the counter that day was tall and slightly stooped, 60 years old, in a gray cardigan with a jeweler's loop pushed up on his forehead like a second pair of eyes. He spread a felt cloth on the glass case, went through the box coin by coin with a pair of cotton gloves, and after 20 minutes of comfortable silence he told her the truth, which was that nearly everything in the box was worth face value or a little more, perhaps $90 for the lot. Then he set one small dime apart from the others, a dull silver thing from 1916 with a tiny letter under the wreath on the back, and told her that this one coin was worth more than everything else in the box multiplied by 100, and that she should have it graded and insured, and that under no circumstances should she sell it to him or to anyone else without getting 3 opinions first, one of which should come from a dealer who disliked him personally, and he wrote that man's name and telephone number on the back of his own business card and slid it across the counter. She had spent her whole career around men who bent the truth for a living. She married the one who wouldn't. The wedding was small, 18 years ago now, in the back garden of the house on 5th Avenue in Saratoga Springs with 24 guests and a string trio and a cake from Mrs. London's. It was a second marriage for them both. Raymond's first wife had left him decades earlier for a man who sold boats in Fort Lauderdale, and they'd had no children, and he spoke of her without bitterness on the rare occasions he spoke of her at all. Adele had been married for 6 years in her 30s to another lawyer, a union that had died of ambition, hers and his both, and she had no children either. What they built together in 18 years was the thing neither of them had managed to build in the first 50, a home that was quiet in the good way. He read Gibbon in the evenings, and she read briefs. And on Sunday mornings he made her eggs with too much butter and told her about the Carson City Mint or the great hoards of Europe, coins sealed in walls before wars and found by plumbers generations later. And she would tell him he was a romantic dressed up as an appraiser. And he would say that every coin that passed across his counter had outlived everyone who ever swore they couldn't live without it, and that a man who handled such things daily was entitled to a little romance. The shop did well. Raymond Voss had a reputation that reached far beyond Saratoga, built over 40 years on a single principle, which was that he would rather lose a sale than shade a grade. Estate lawyers from Albany to Montreal sent widows to him because he was the one dealer guaranteed to tell them what their husband's collections were actually worth. He testified as an expert in 4 states. Twice a year he flew to the big auctions in Dallas or Baltimore, and he came home with stories instead of purchases more often than not, because the prices offended him. Dean Keller arrived in the 12th year of that reputation, hired to handle what he called the investment side. He was charming in the fluent, frictionless way of a man who had practiced it, good with the customers who wanted to talk about gold as a hedge rather than as history, and he grew that side of the business fourfold in a decade. Raymond gave him a minority stake in year 5. Adele never warmed to him and never had a reason she could put in a sentence, which bothered her, because she had spent her professional life demanding that people put their reasons in sentences. The closest she ever came was one night after a dinner at the shop's 20th anniversary, riding home in the dark, when she said that Keller listened the way a man reads a contract, hunting for the clause he could use, and Raymond was silent for half a mile and then said, in a voice she rarely heard from him, that he had the same feeling sometimes, and that he had begun keeping his own counsel on certain matters. And when she asked what matters, he patted her knee and changed the subject to the leaves turning along the north way. And she let him, and for the rest of her life, she would wonder how different everything might have been if she had pressed him that night, instead of watching the maples go by in the dark. The dying took 14 months. It started with a shortness of breath on the stairs that he hid from her for half a year, the way men of his generation hid things, out of a courtesy so old it had fused with the bone. Then came the diagnosis, a heart wearing out at the valves, and the calendar of specialists, and the surgery. They finally decided he was too frail to survive, and the long, slow ebbing that followed. He kept going to the shop 3 days a week until he couldn't manage the sidewalk ice, and after that Keller came to the house instead, twice a week, always with papers, sitting with Raymond in the study with the door closed while Adele made coffee nobody drank. She thought nothing of it at the time. It was the business. There was always paper in the business. What she noticed and dismissed and would later lie awake cataloging were the smaller things. Raymond's signature had grown unsteady that final year, the R collapsing into the A, the whole name listing to the right like a ship taking water, and yet he kept signing, kept insisting on signing, waving off her offer to be given power of attorney with an evasiveness that stung her at the time. Twice she came into the study to find him not with Keller's papers at all, but with a green ledger she didn't recognize, a tall, old-fashioned thing with a cloth spine, and both times he closed it without hurry, the way an innocent man closes a book, and asked her what was for supper. And once, in the last spring of his life, she found him at his desk at 2 in the morning in his pajamas with the desk lamp burning, writing a letter in longhand, and when she asked him what on earth he was doing awake, he looked up at her with an expression she had never seen on him in 18 years, something between tenderness and apology, and said, "Della, if it ever comes apart, read your Blackstone." She had laughed, because it was 2 in the morning and he was 73 years old and the sentence made no sense, and she steered him up to bed, and by morning he seemed himself again, and she put it down to the medication, which the cardiologist had warned could make him foggy at night. He died on the 4th of November, at home, in the bed they had shared for 18 years, with her hand in his. His last word was her name, not Adele. Della, the name nobody else on earth had ever called her. 11 days later, she learned what Dean Keller had been building behind that closed study door, and the second life of Adele Voss, the one nobody could have predicted, least of all her, began in a lawyer's conference room on a Tuesday morning that smelled of burnt coffee and rain. The offices of Harmon, Pruitt, and Lowe occupied the 3rd floor of a brick building on Church Street, and the conference room where the estate of Raymond Voss was read had a long walnut table and a view of a parking garage. Adele arrived 5 minutes early, as she had arrived 5 minutes early to every proceeding of her adult life. Keller was already there, seated, which told her something before a word was spoken, because a man who arrives first to a room chooses his ground. Beside him sat a lawyer she didn't know, a smooth-faced man from an Albany firm whose card identified him as counsel to Voss and Keller Rare Coin and Bullion LLC, and beside the lawyer sat Vernon Sipes, the shop's bookkeeper for the past 9 years, a small damp-palmed man who had never once in 9 years looked Adele in the eye and did not start now. Walter Pruitt, who had drawn Raymond's will a decade earlier and had a kind face and bad knees, read the document itself in under 10 minutes, because the document was simple. Raymond had left everything to Adele. The house on Fifth Avenue, his interest in the shop, the brokerage accounts, the insurance, all of it, to my wife, the Honorable Adele Voss, with my whole heart. Pruitt read that phrase, with my whole heart, and looked up over his glasses and smiled at her. And for one clean moment Adele believed the worst thing that would happen in that room had already happened, in a bedroom on Fifth Avenue 11 days before. Then the Albany lawyer opened his briefcase. What he laid on the walnut table, document by document, with the unhurried confidence of a man dealing from a stacked deck, was a different account of the last 2 years of Raymond Voss's life. There were promissory notes, 4 of them, bearing Raymond's signature, by which Raymond had personally borrowed a total of $2.1 million from the partnership to cover what the lawyer called adverse positions in the bullion market. There was a security agreement pledging the Fifth Avenue house against those notes. There was an amendment to the partnership agreement, dated 18 months back, converting Keller's minority stake into a controlling interest in the event of Raymond's death or incapacity, in consideration of the loans. There was a personal guarantee that swept in the brokerage accounts, the accounts that held not only Raymond's savings but the better part of Adele's own, because they had merged their finances in the second year of the marriage like the trusting middle-aged newlyweds they had been. And stapled to each instrument was a notarial certificate, embossed and initialed, attesting that Raymond Voss had appeared and signed of his own free will, and every certificate bore the seal and signature of Vernon Sipes, Notary Public, State of New York. Adele sat very still and read every page, in order, twice, while the rain ticked against the window, because reading every page in order twice was what she knew how to do. The signatures were good. That was the first thing she saw, and the worst. They were not tracings. They were performances, fluent and confident, and they were wrong in a way she could feel in her teeth and could not yet prove, because they were too fluent. The real Raymond of the past 2 years had signed like a man rowing against a current. The Raymond on these pages signed like a man of 50. Whoever had made these signatures had studied old checks, old deeds, the strong hand of a healthy man, and had never once sat across a kitchen table from the actual dying one, watching him grip the pen like a banister. She looked up from the 4th note and found Keller watching her with an expression of gentle, sorrowful patience, the expression of a doctor delivering a hard diagnosis, and beneath it, visible only to someone who had spent 2 decades studying the faces of the guilty at the moment they believed themselves safe, a flicker of something that was almost pleasure. Raymond never borrowed $1 in his life, she said. Her voice came out level. 40 years in that shop, and he never carried debt past the 30 days on an auction invoice. You know that better than anyone in this room. The market humbled a lot of good men these past few years, Adele, Keller said softly. He was proud. He didn't want you to know. He made me swear, and God forgive me, I swore. He was dying, she said. His hands shook so badly that last winter he let his soup go cold rather than lift the spoon in front of me. And you want this room to believe he sat in our study and signed 4 loan documents with the penmanship of a man half his age. The lawyer from Albany slid a letter across the table, typed on shop letterhead, signed with that same fluent, impossible hand, in which Raymond Voss thanked his partner for his discretion and directed that his wife not be troubled with the details of the firm's finances during his illness. It was, Adele had to concede as a professional matter, beautifully done. It anticipated her. It weaponized his tenderness. Whoever had drafted that letter had understood that the truest thing about Raymond Voss was that he would endure anything to spare her pain, and had built the forgery on that foundation the way you build a counterfeit on a genuine coin. She hired a lawyer of her own the next morning, a sharp, decent woman named Corinne Beatty, and Corinne told her the truth over the desk the way Raymond had once told her the truth over a cigar box, which was that the case could be won and would take years. Handwriting experts contradicting other handwriting experts. Motions and counter-motions. A Circuit Court judge, the Honorable Lorna Fitch, who was not corrupt but was bound to the paper in front of her, and the paper was immaculate. Vernon Sipes and his notarial seal standing like a locked door in front of every question, because in the eyes of the law a notarized instrument is presumed valid, and presumption is a castle that costs a fortune to besiege. Meanwhile, the notes were in default the moment the estate opened, and the security agreement gave the partnership the right to move on the house, and the guarantee froze the accounts, and Adele's judicial pension, the one asset in her own untouchable name, came to $5,800 a month, which sounded like plenty until it was set against retainers that burned $20,000 in a slow month. The freeze came down in December. The house went into the firm's hands in January, through a proceeding so orderly and so cold that Adele, sitting in the back row of a courtroom she had once presided in, felt as if she were watching her own life administered by strangers. She was given 30 days to vacate a house she had lived in for 18 years. Word traveled through Saratoga the way word travels through any small rich town, on rails of sympathy greased with delight. The Saratogan ran a story headlined "Retired Judge Entangled in Estate Dispute," written with scrupulous fairness, and the fairness was the cruelest part, because fairness required printing Keller's account, and Keller's account, quoted at length beside a photograph of him looking somber in front of the shop, was that a great man had made quiet mistakes at the end of his life, and that the firm bore his widow no ill will whatsoever and hoped for an amicable resolution. 3 separate women from the hospital gala committee told Adele how brave she was, in the tone reserved for the contagious. Raymond's cousin Maxine Voss, who had been served lobster at Adele's table every Christmas for 18 years, was heard to remark at the reading room that Raymond had always been secretive, that family was family, and Adele, after all, had come along late, and that in her opinion the judge had lived rather grandly for a public servant, and perhaps the correction was overdue. The invitation stopped. The phone went from ringing constantly to ringing twice a week, and one of the two was usually Corinne with a bill. In the 3rd week of January, sorting the study for the movers under the terms of a court order that itemized which chairs she was permitted to take, Adele found the deed. It was in the bottom drawer of Raymond's desk, in a manila folder marked, in his hand, Aldercroft, taxes, and it was 2 years old. By a deed recorded in the Madison County Clerk's office, Raymond had conveyed to Adele Voss, as her sole and separate property, a parcel of some 30 acres with improvements thereon, in the town of Fenwick Hollow, being the same premises conveyed to Caspar Voss in 1891. She had signed nothing and known nothing. A gift deed required only the giver. He had given her a piece of the earth without ever mentioning it, 2 full years before he died, back when the diagnosis was new and the tremor was small, and he had paid the transfer tax and the recording fee and filed the folder under her name in his own desk and gone on making her eggs on Sundays. She knew of Aldercroft the way one knows of a relative's old war. It was the Voss family place, the stone house Raymond's grandfather had built, 3 hours west, somewhere in the folded hill country south of Route 20. Raymond drove out alone 2 or 3 times a year, to check the roof, he said, and see the taxes paid. And he always came back a day later smelling of cold air and dust with slate chips in the truck bed, and in 18 years he had never once invited her along, and she, occupied with a docket that never shrank, had never once asked to come. It was the single locked room in a marriage that had no others, and she had let it stay locked because he was a man entitled to one. Corinne brought the deed to the attention of Keller's lawyers, braced for a fight, and got instead the most contemptuous surrender of her career. The Albany lawyer reviewed the county records, noted that the parcel lay outside the estate and beyond the reach of the notes, observed that its full assessed value was $41,000, that $9,200 in back taxes had gone unpaid since Raymond's final autumn, that the house had been flagged by the town code officer as unfit for occupancy pending repairs, and stated that his clients would waive any conceivable claim. Keller himself, encountering Adele on Broadway a week before the vacate date, in front of the shop that now bore his name first on the fresh gold lettering, offered his condolences on the whole sad business and said, with a warmth that did not travel the last quarter inch into his eyes, that he was glad she'd have somewhere to land, and that he'd been out that way once years ago, and that she should watch the porch boards, and he smiled at her, and got into his German car, and drove away, through the gray slush of the town that had already finished forgetting her. She left Saratoga Springs on the 1st of February in a 12-year-old Buick with 190,000 miles on it, bought for $2,200 after the lease on her own car proved to be one more thing that had lived inside the frozen accounts. Everything she still owned rode in the back seat, and the trunk. 6 boxes of clothes. 2 boxes of books the order had permitted her, packed by movers under the supervision of a paralegal who checked titles against a list. A carton of photographs. Her mother's cigar box, with the 1916 dime still in it, graded and slabbed in plastic. The one thing of value she had refused on principle to sell, because Raymond had told her not to. The Goodwill blankets. A cast-iron kettle. And on the passenger seat, riding where he should have been, the manila folder marked YLDR0FT, taxes in the handwriting of a dead man who had, it turned out, kept exactly one secret from her, and possibly two. The drive took most of the short winter afternoon. The thruway gave way to Route 20, and Route 20 gave way to county roads that ran between hills like a rumpled bedsheet, and the towns got smaller and farther apart until they were mostly a church, a diner, and a gas station wearing different arrangements of the same white paint. Fenwick Hollow announced itself with a green sign, a feed store, a diner called the Copper Skillet, and a blinking yellow light, and was gone in the rearview mirror in under a minute. 3 miles past the light, at the top of a rise where the plows had banked the snow shoulder high, a mailbox on a cedar post carried the ghost of a name in weathered paint, Voss, and a gravel lane turned off between 2 lines of sugar maples a century old, and Adele turned the Buick in and let it roll to a stop and sat looking at what her husband had left her. Aldercroft stood at the end of the lane on a shelf of ground above a frozen creek, and her first feeling, before the dismay, was surprise, because it was beautiful. Not pretty. Nothing about it was pretty. It was a tall 4-square house of gray fieldstone with walls that even from the lane looked absurdly thick, 2 full stories under a slate roof, with a stone L running off the back and a porch across the front whose roof had begun a long, slow bow toward the ground. The slates had shed from one corner of the L, leaving bare boards silvered with weather. The porch steps had rotted at the ends. Every window on the ground floor wore shutters of gray board, nailed fast, and dead goldenrod stood hip-high through the crust of snow in what had been a dooryard. It looked exactly like what the assessor said it was, an abandoned farmhouse dying of neglect in a county full of them. And under that, in its bones, in the plumb of its corners and the tight courses of its stone, it looked like something else, something the assessor had no column for. It looked like a thing built by a man who did not expect to be forgiven for errors. It looked, she would think much later, less like a farmhouse than like a bank wearing a farmhouse's clothes. Caspar Voss had built it in 1891. She knew that much from the deed and from the scraps Raymond had let fall over 18 years of Sunday breakfasts. Caspar had been a vault man, an engineer for a safe and lock works in Rochester in the great age of American bank building, a man who spent his working life designing the doors behind which other men's fortunes slept, and who had taken his wages out into the hills of Madison County and raised a house of stone for a family that dwindled instead of grew. His son had farmed the 30 acres without talent. His grandson had fled to Saratoga at 19 with a coin collection and a grudge against dairy cattle, and had become Raymond Voss of Broadway, and had driven back out 3 times a year for 50 years, alone, to a house nobody lived in, to check the roof. The key from the manila folder, a heavy old barrel key wrapped in a note that said front door in Raymond's hand, turned the lock as if the lock had been oiled in the fall, and she would remember that detail later too. Inside, the cold was total, a stored, patient, stone-walled cold, and the light through the shuttered windows came in blades. Sheets covered the furniture like a gathering of the dead. A long case clock stood against the parlor wall with its hands stopped at 20 minutes past 5. The air smelled of dust and cold ash and, faintly, of lamp oil, and the floors, when she crossed them, did not creak, because Caspar Voss had laid them out of oak 2 inches thick, and 80 winters had not moved them a 16th of an inch. She walked the whole of the ground floor once with her coat still buttoned, breath showing. A 69-year-old woman alone in a dead man's dead house at the far end of a February afternoon, and then the last of the light went out of the window blades, and the size of it all arrived at once. The grave and the conference room, and the headline, and the 30 days, and the 300 miles. And Adele Voss sat down on a sheeted chair in the dark parlor of Aldercroft, and wept the way she had not permitted herself to weep at the funeral, in great ragged unjudicial sobs that echoed off stone, for Raymond, for the house on Fifth Avenue, for 18 years dismantled in 11 weeks by a man with a pocket square, and for herself last of all. And when it was over, she wiped her face with the heels of her gloved hands and located, by flashlight, the kitchen and the iron cookstove and a wood box that some hand had left full. And she built a fire. She was 3 days learning the house's mercies. The woodshed off the kitchen held 4 full cords, seasoned, split, and stacked with a neatness that raised the hair on her arms when she finally understood it. Because seasoned wood meant wood laid in a year or two ahead, and the only hands that could have stacked it were hands that had since been folded across a chest in Greenridge Cemetery. There was a drilled well with a hand pump in the kitchen itself. Indoors, a 19th century luxury that worked on the 4th stroke and drew water so cold it ached. There was a privy out back and a chemical toilet, still sealed in its box, on the pantry floor, purchased, said the receipt taped to it, 14 months ago. There were oil lamps with full reservoirs. There were wool blankets in a cedar chest that smelled of the same cedar as the chest at 5th Avenue. Raymond had been provisioning this house, in his last provisioning years, the way a man provisions a lifeboat, and had never said one word, and every fresh discovery was a conversation with him that she could not have, and she went back and forth between gratitude and fury at him a dozen times a day, and both felt like love with nowhere to go. On the 4th morning a truck came up the lane, an old wagoneer the color of tomato soup with a plow blade on the front, and out of it climbed a tall spare man of about her own age in a canvas coat and a wool cap, who stopped a respectful distance from the porch and called out that his name was Gideon Price, that he had the farm at the bottom of the hill, that he'd seen chimney smoke 3 days running, and thought it was time he stopped pretending he hadn't. He had a long, weathered face and pale blue eyes and the deliberate hands of a man who had spent a working life persuading frightened animals to hold still. He had been the large animal veterinarian for that end of the county for 41 years, retired now 6, a widower now 4. When Adele introduced herself, he took off the wool cap, which she would learn was a thing he did at names that deserved it, and said he'd known Ray Voss since they were boys at the Fenwick Hollow School, and that he was sorry, and the word had weight when he said it, the specific weight of a man who had buried a wife named Nell and knew exactly what he was saying. He asked no questions about why the widow of Ray Voss was living without electricity in a shuttered stone house in February. He looked at the chimney, and at the porch roof, and at her city boots, and he drove away, and came back 2 hours later with a chainsaw, a roll of roofing felt, a pair of pock boots that had been Nell's and were only half a size large, and a bushel basket holding a Dutch oven of venison stew, 6 jars of tomatoes, and a sack of potatoes with the dirt still on them. He jacked the porch roof that afternoon with a screw jack and a locust post, and made it safe if not straight. He showed her the trick of the stove damper. He told her the frost line ran deep this far up the hill, and the pump handle wanted a blanket on the worst nights. When she tried to speak to him about payment, he considered her for a moment and said that Nell had kept the books on the practice for 40 years and had a rule that neighbors' animals in trouble got seen first and billed last, and that as near as he could tell Adele was a neighbor, and her situation qualified as an animal in trouble, and that was the end of the discussion, then and always. Through February the two of them assembled, without ever naming it, a small economy of survival. He plowed her lane when he plowed his own. She, who had judged the work of 1,000 lawyers, took over a dispute he was having with an insurance company about a barn roof and wrote them a letter that produced a check inside 3 weeks, and Gideon read the copy she gave him twice and said, with real awe, that it was the meanest polite thing he had ever seen on paper. She learned the house. She learned to bank a fire so it held till morning, to bathe out of the iron kettle, to cook on wood, to sleep in wool. She grew lean and her hands roughened and her hip complained on the stairs, and some mornings the sheer arithmetic of her life, 69 years old, widowed, defrauded, 300 miles from the nearest person who had ever called her judge, sat on her chest like a stone. But she was, as her mother used to say of the women of Blandina Street, made of Utica brick, and every morning she got up and lit the fire and went on. And in the last week of February, with the deep cold easing and her days no longer wholly spent on staying alive, Adele Voss finally turned her full attention to the one door in Aldercroft that the barrel key ring in the kitchen would not open. She had found the door on her first full day in the house and had been failing to open it, at intervals, ever since. It stood at the end of the north hall on the ground floor, past the parlor and the dining room, in the oldest and thickest-walled part of the original block, and everything about it was wrong in ways that took her weeks to finish counting. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. Every other interior door at Aldercroft was a 4-panel pine door on iron butts, painted the same tired cream, openable with any of the 3 skeleton keys that hung on nails by the kitchen. This door was oak, quarter sawn, 3 inches thick if it was an inch, crossed with 2 flat straps of black iron, and it hung on massive offset hinges whose pins, she discovered when she thought to look, were welded. It had no knob. It had a cast bronze pull, and below the pull a bronze escutcheon covering a keyway unlike anything on a farmhouse door, a small precise slot with beveled wards, the kind of keyway she associated, without at first knowing why, with the safe deposit vault in the basement of the Adirondack Trust, where she and Raymond had kept their passports and her mother's dime before the dime came home in a coat pocket. Above the escutcheon, flush with the oak, sat a ring of engraved bronze the size of a coffee cup's mouth, a wheel of letters, 26 of them around its rim, with a small brass pointer at the top, and the wheel turned under her fingers with a smooth, oiled click, click, click that was the single most un-farmhouse sound she had ever heard. The room behind it was the study. She knew it was the study because the 1951 fire insurance survey she found in the pantry, a folded, brittle map of the house drawn for a Utica insurance company, labeled its study in a draftsman's hand. The survey also showed the study with a window in the north wall. Standing in hip-deep snow outside the north wall, Adele found no window. She found, when she cleared the dead vines with a glove, a rectangle of stonework subtly younger than the wall around it, coursed with a shade more mortar, where a window had been closed up by a mason who was very good and wanted it not to show. And the survey put the study at 14 feet deep. Pacing the hall, pacing the dining room beside it, pacing the outside wall twice with a knotted string because she did not trust her stride in snow. She could not make the arithmetic of Aldercroft produce 14 feet. The house was deeper on the outside than it was on the inside. Somewhere in the middle of the original block, swallowed between the study and the back wall, there were 9 feet that did not exist. She was a judge. She had spent 22 years listening to the gap between the record and the truth, and here was that gap rendered in fieldstone, and she began, in the evenings, by lamplight, with a rigor that would have amused and not surprised anyone who had ever appeared before her, to assemble the case. Item. Raymond had come here alone, 3 times a year, for the whole of their marriage, and for decades before it. Item. In the spring 4 years past, before the diagnosis, she had gone looking in his study on Fifth Avenue for a stamp and found instead, in the letter tray, a freight receipt from a firm called Mohawk Valley Cartage, for delivery of goods described only as household, 8 crates, from Saratoga Springs to Fenwick Hollow, and when she asked him about it at dinner he said, without a flicker, roof slate and shelving, and she believed him, because in 18 years he had never given her a reason not to. Item. The wood was stacked and the lamps were filled, and the lifeboat was provisioned by a dying man who told her nothing but conveyed her the deed. Item. Dean Keller had said, on Broadway, in the slush, I was out that way once, years ago, and Raymond had never in his life invited Keller to Aldercroft, and so either Keller was lying to be pleasant, which was possible, or Keller had gone looking on his own, which was a different kind of fact altogether. Item. And then, in the first week of March, the letter came and turned suspicion into something with a pulse. It arrived in the mailbox on the Cedar Post, forwarded twice, on the letterhead of the Albany firm, and it was 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph hoped this found her well. The second advised that its client, Voss and Keller Rare Coin and Bullion LLC, wished, purely in recognition of the property's sentimental significance to the Voss family legacy, to offer the sum of $90,000 for the Fenwick Hollow parcel, as is, closing at her convenience, taxes brought current by the purchaser, and looked forward to her prompt reply. Adele read it standing at the mailbox in the wind with her breath blowing sideways, and then she read it again at the kitchen table, and what she heard under the lawyer's language was as plain to her as a raised voice. 2 months ago, these same men had put a value of $41,000 on this land in open court and waved it away with a sneer. She could still feel. A man who has taken your house, your accounts, and your husband's name off the front of his own shop does not pay double the assessed price for 30 acres of rock and a condemned farmhouse out of sentiment. He pays it because something has told him, some receipt, some freight record, some loose thread in 40 years of Raymond's paper that he has finally had the leisure to pull, that the worthless parcel is the only mistake he made, and he wants the mistake back before anyone else understands it was one. She did not answer the letter. She fed it to the cook stove and watched the firm's letterhead curl, and that night she carried the lamp down the north hall and stood a long time in front of the door with the bronze wheel, listening to the house hold its breath. For days later, Gideon mentioned, in the unhurried sideways manner he used for things he considered significant, that a fellow in a gray Tahoe with Saratoga County plates had come into the copper skillet asking after the old Voss place, whether anyone was living out there, whether the widow was the sort to sell, and that Doreen at the counter, who had known Nell Price for 40 years and therefore considered Gideon's neighbors her own, had told the fellow the road up that hill washed out in March, and the widow kept dogs, neither of which was true, and had washed him out of the parking lot. Adele thanked him. Gideon put his cap back on and said, to the middle distance, that in 41 years of practice he had learned that when something starts circling a pasture, you don't wait to find out what it is, you get the stock in the barn, and he drove off down the hill, leaving her to decide exactly what, on this farm, counted as the stock. Item. And this one she took out and examined last every night, the way you save the strongest card. Della, if it ever comes apart, read your Blackstone. Her Blackstone was in the second box of books. It had come through the movers and the paralegal and the itemized order because it was hers beyond argument, her name on the flyleaf in Raymond's hand. Given the day she was sworn in as a judge 16 years ago, the 4 volumes of Blackstone's commentaries in a 19th century binding, calf over boards, that he had bought at an estate sale in Glens Falls and had rebacked for her by a binder in Albany. She had read at them dutifully the first year and shelved them with honor ever after, and they had stood on the shelf nearest her desk through her whole appellate career, and she had packed them with her own hands in January. And it was the measure of those months, of grief lying on her like snow on a roof, that a woman of her mind did not sit down with those 4 volumes until the first night of March, when the wind was working the shutters and the stew was gone and there was nothing left in the day to do but think. Volume 1 was a book. Volume 2 was a book. Volume 3 was a book. Volume 4 was heavier than Volume 3. She noticed it the way she had noticed a witness's hands for 22 years, below thought, and then above it. She weighed one in each hand in the lamplight for a long moment, an old woman in a wool coat in a stone kitchen, holding the English common law in her 2 hands like a scale. Then she opened Volume 4. The text block ended at page 408, and after it came what looked like the marbled rear end papers, and the end papers did not lie flat, and when she pressed them the board of the back cover gave a fraction, hollow, and she fetched the paring knife, and, apologizing aloud to the binder in Albany, slit the paper along the hinge. The backboard of the book had been built up into a shallow box, and the box held 3 things. The first was a key. It was small, machined steel with a bronze bow, milled with the beveled wards of the slot in the study door, and it was wrapped in waxed paper against the ears, and the paper was folded around it with the neatness of the woodpile. The second was a photograph, black and white, scalloped edges, of 2 men standing in front of the north wall of Aldercroft in shirt sleeves, squinting in old sunlight. One was unmistakably a Voss, tall and stooped, even young, and on the back, in pencil, in a hand older than Raymond's, it said Casper, and the door, October, 1938. The third was a letter, one page, in Raymond's long hand, in the strong, steady script of a man writing while he still could, and dated in the spring of the year he had recorded the deed. She read it standing, and then she read it sitting, and then she read it a third time out loud, alone, to the stopped clock and the stone walls, because some things have to be heard in a human voice, even your own. Della, if you are reading this in the ordinary course of a long life together, put it back, say nothing, and I will tell you the whole of it on your birthday, because I have decided this year I finally will. But if it has come apart, if I am gone and Dean has done what I believe he has been preparing to do, then forgive me first and listen second. I have known for some time what my partner is. I could not prove it fast enough to beat what is wrong with my heart, and I could not tell you, because the moment you knew, you would have acted, my love. You were built to act, and he would have seen it in your face across a dinner table and moved first, and everything would have been in the courts for 10 years, and you would have grown old in conference rooms fighting over paper while he spent the money on lawyers. So I have done a quiet thing instead, the only kind of thing a slow old man can still do well. What the banks could not keep safe from him, Stonewell. My grandfather built one room of this house to outlast every argument, and everything I was, everything we are, is on the other side of that door, along with every fact about Dean Keller that a courtroom will ever need. The key is in your hand. The word is the one I called you that no one else ever did. Set the wheel, turn the key, and understand, before you open the door, that I did not hide this from you. I hid it for you. There is a difference, and no one on this earth is better fitted to weigh it than you. All my love, all my life. Adele Voss did not sleep that night, and for the first time in 4 months, the sleeplessness had nothing to do with grief. She sat by the stove with the letter and the photograph and the small cold key, and outside the wind came off the ridge and found the corners of a house built by a vault engineer, and got nothing for its trouble, and toward 5 in the morning she banked the fire, and lit the tin lantern, and walked down the north hall in Nell Price's boots with her heart going like a girl's. The bronze wool turned under her fingers, click by click, in the lantern light. D-E-L-L-A. 5 letters, and on the 5th there came from inside the oak a sound she felt through the floor rather than heard, a deep, soft mechanical consent, the sound of a machine 80 years old remembering its purpose. She took the steel key out of her cardigan pocket. Her hands, which had not shaken in any courtroom in 22 years, were shaking now, and she let them, because there was no one to see, and because some tremors are earned. She fitted the key to the beveled slot below the pull, and it went home with the silken certainty of Casper Voss's whole life's work, and she stood one more moment in the cold hallway, an old woman at a door, with everything she had lost behind her and everything her husband had been on the other side. Then she turned the key, and deep in the stone, one after another, patient as the law itself, the bolts began to draw back. The door did not swing so much as settle, the way a held breath settles when it is finally let go, 3 inches inward on hinges that a lifetime of grease had kept from ever learning to complain. Adele stood in the north hall with the tin lantern raised and did not move for a long moment, because the cold that came out of the gap was a different cold than the cold of the rest of the house, drier, older, a cold that had never once in 80 years met the weather. She set her free hand flat against the oak and pushed, and the door went the rest of the way on its own weight, slow and enormous, and the lantern light went into the room ahead of her the way light goes into water. The study was smaller than the missing 9 feet had promised, because 2 of those feet, she understood at a glance, had gone into the walls themselves. Walls faced in the same dressed fieldstone as the exterior but laid, she would learn from a mason months later, over a full course of poured concrete and a skin of riveted steel plate. The whole assembly built by a man who had spent his working life designing rooms that other men's money slept in and had finally, at the end of his career, built one for himself. The floor was poured concrete as well, swept clean, and along the near wall stood a bank of steel shelving, and on the shelving, row upon patient row, sat wooden crates, each one banded in iron strap, each one stenciled in black paint with a code she did not yet understand, and each one, she saw as the lantern found them one by one, addressed in the same stenciled hand to R. Voss, Aldercroft. She counted without meaning to, the old habit of a woman who had spent 22 years demanding that every number in a courtroom be accounted for. 31 crates on the near wall. A second bank behind it, in shadow, that she would not properly see until she brought a stronger light, held more again. Against the far wall stood a plain oak desk that could have come from any lawyer's office in the county, and on the desk, squared with the edge in a way that told her someone had left it there on purpose and for her, sat a green cloth ledger. The same green ledger she remembered him closing without hurry on 2 occasions in the last year of his life, and beside the ledger a brass desk lamp, and beside the lamp, coiled neatly, an extension cord running to an outlet box on the wall that had no business having power in a house with the electricity shut off at the pole, until she understood, walking closer, that the outlet fed from a bank of deep cycle batteries in the corner, charged, the little gauge told her, and waiting, like everything else in that room, for exactly this night. She did not touch the crates first. She went to the desk, because that was who she was, and she sat down in Raymond's chair, cold through her coat, and she turned the lamp switch, and warm electric light filled a room that had not seen it in what the dust on the shelving told her was years, and she opened the green ledger to its first page. Property and Provenance, it read, in his hand, the strong hand of the man he had been before the tremor came for him. And beneath the heading, in columns ruled with a straight edge, an inventory began. Not of the whole room, of 1 crate at a time, numbered to match the stencils on the shelving, each line giving a date, a source, a description, a weight, an assay reference, and a running total, and Adele Voss, who had balanced her own household books every month of her adult life without needing a calculator, found her eyes going first to the last entry on the last completed page, because that was the number that would tell her, in one glance, the size of the thing she was sitting inside of. She had to read it 3 times before her mind would accept what her eyes reported. The running total at the foot of the final page, dated the autumn before his diagnosis, in his own steady figures, stood at $445 million. She set the ledger down flat on the desk and put both hands over it, the way she might have covered a witness's exhibit to keep it from blowing off a table. And she sat very still in the cold electric light and made herself breathe the way she had once taught herself to breathe before delivering a sentence in a capital case, slow, through the nose, counting. $445 million. She said it aloud, once in the empty vault, to see if the room would answer. And the room answered only with the small tick of the batteries and the wind finding the eaves far above her, 3 stories up, in a world that still believed this house held nothing but a bad roof and back taxes. She made herself stand and walk to the shelving before her mind could run ahead of her feet, because a judge does not accept a claim without examining the exhibit, however extraordinary the claim, and she pried the lid from the nearest crate with a flat bar she found leaning, deliberately, against the shelf where a hand had left it for exactly this purpose. Straw packing first, the old-fashioned kind, and under the straw, wrapped in oiled paper gone soft with decades, gold. Not coins, not the small bright collector pieces Raymond had spent his life selling across a glass counter. Bars, dull and heavy and entirely without romance, each one stamped along its flank with a refiner's mark she did not recognize and a serial number and a fineness she did recognize, because she had heard Raymond say the number 100 times at dinner over the years, the way another man might quote a batting average. She lifted 1 bar free with both hands and nearly dropped it, astonished at a weight her arms had not been braced for, and she stood holding it in the lamplight with her breath fogging in front of her, an old woman in a dead man's boots holding more money in 2 hands than she had earned in 22 years on the bench, and she understood, with a clarity that arrived less like triumph than like grief finding a new room to live in, that Raymond Voss had spent the last years of his life, steadily and completely emptying every account he could touch, converting 4 decades of a shrewd man's fortune into the one form of wealth that a forger's pen and a corrupt notary's seal could never reach, and had carried it, crate by crate, 300 miles, to bury it inside a room his own grandfather had built to be unbreakable, and had told no one, not even her, because telling her would have meant telling Keller, because the 2 of them shared a life so thoroughly that Raymond had judged, correctly, that any secret she carried would eventually show on her face. She sat back down at the desk before her knees could decide the matter for her, and she turned to the second section of the green ledger, and here the entries stopped being about gold at all. The second section was headed, in Raymond's hand, simply, Dean, and it read less like a ledger than like the private notes of a man building a case against himself, or rather against a man he had once trusted like a son, entry by dated entry, over 3 full years. She read it the way she had read 10,000 pages of testimony in her working life, without letting herself react until the whole of it had been taken in, and only when she reached the final page did she allow her hands to shake. The first entries were small, almost apologetic, a man noting discrepancies he did not yet want to believe. A consignment of graded coins from a Philadelphia estate that Keller had logged as sold at auction for a modest sum, when Raymond's own contact at that auction house, a friend of 30 years, mentioned over lunch that the same lot had in fact brought nearly triple, the difference vanishing somewhere between the hammer and the firm's books. A pattern, once Raymond began looking, of high-value bullion purchases made in the firm's name from a dealer in Zurich who did not, on inquiry through a coin trade association contact, appear to exist at any address the wire transfers claimed. A storage facility in Utica, leased in the name of Keller Numismatic Holdings, a company Raymond had never heard of and had certainly never authorized, its rent paid in cash by a courier twice a year. The middle entries grew methodical, because Raymond Voss had spent 40 years learning to distrust a fluent story and demand the paper behind it. And once he stopped extending Keller the courtesy of belief, he began building a file with the patience of a much younger man. He copied wire confirmations before Keller could shred them, working late after Keller had gone home. A 72-year-old man with a failing heart hunched over a photocopier by himself in a dark shop, telling Adele he had stayed to finish inventory. He obtained, through the same friend of 30 years, records from the Philadelphia house showing the true hammer prices on 11 separate lots across 4 years, a discrepancy that by itself totaled past $900,000, siphoned in increments small enough that no single theft would have drawn an auditor's eye. In a business where inventory turned constantly and grading disputes were routine, and a shrinkage of a few percent was simply the cost of doing trade in objects whose value existed mostly in the eye of the beholder. He traced the phantom Zurich dealer to a numbered account that led, through 2 further shell companies whose formation documents he obtained by paying a retired private investigator named Frank Ostrander in cash, to a holding company controlled, at the end of every trail, unmistakably, by Dean Keller himself. And then, dated 18 months before Raymond's death, in a hand that had already begun the first faint tremor Adele would spend the following year learning to read like a barometer, came the entry that explained the promissory notes. I understand it now, he had written. He is not stealing in secret to grow rich in secret. He is stealing to build a debt that does not exist, so that when the moment comes, and Adele will know when I say the moment, he can produce paper showing that I borrowed against the firm rather than that he stole from it. And he will use my own hand against me, because Vernon owes him money he cannot repay and will notarize whatever is placed in front of him. I have watched him study my signature for a year under the excuse of authenticating estate items. I know what he is building. I cannot stop it with the strength I have left, and I will not risk Adele's safety or her standing by moving against a man clever enough to make her look like an accomplice before I can finish proving otherwise. So I will do the only thing an old man dying by inches can still do honestly. I will take everything he cannot reach beyond his reach, and I will leave every fact I have gathered where only she, of all people living, will know to look, because a lifetime on the bench taught her exactly how to read a case built the way I have built this one. In the order a court will want it, sourced the way a court will demand it be sourced. There followed, indexed and cross-referenced in a system that bore Raymond's affection for precision on every page, copies of every document Frank Ostrander had produced, the shell company filings, the wire confirmations, photographs of storage facility gate logs, a signed and dated statement from the friend at the Philadelphia auction house, and, last, folded into a plain envelope at the back of the ledger, a single sheet in Vernon Sipes's own cramped hand, and signed, undated, evidently drafted, and never sent, that began, "Ray, I know what he's making me do isn't right," and broke off 4 lines later in the middle of a sentence, as though the small, damp-palmed bookkeeper had lost his nerve before he could finish confessing even to paper. Adele read the whole of it twice through, and by the time she closed the ledger, the lamp had burned down and the eastern sky beyond the sealed north window, which she now understood had been sealed by Caspar Voss's own hand nearly 90 years ago for exactly the privacy his grandson had finally needed, was going the color of a healing bruise. She had spent 4 months believing herself a victim of a fraud she could not disprove fast enough, grieving a marriage that a courtroom of strangers had been permitted to reduce to disputed paper, and she understood now, sitting in an underground room built by a dead engineer and provisioned by a dying husband, that she had never for 1 hour been without a case. She had simply not yet found the file. She did not sleep that morning. She built the fire up instead, and made coffee in the enamel pot, and sat at the kitchen table with the green ledger and a legal pad. And by the time full daylight came over the ridge, she had done the thing she had spent her whole career teaching young lawyers to do before they let feeling get ahead of them, which was to write down, in plain declarative sentences, exactly what she knew, exactly what she could prove, and exactly what she still needed. She knew Keller had stolen from the partnership for years. She could prove a portion of it through Frank Ostrander's paper trail and the Philadelphia hammer prices, though some of Raymond's sourcing would need to be independently re-established, because a dead man's notes, however exact and orderly, were not themselves evidence a prosecutor could simply hand a jury. She needed the gold authenticated by someone with no relationship to Keller and no motive to talk. She needed Vernon Sipes's unfinished confession turned into a finished one, which meant finding Vernon Sipes and finding out whether 4 months of watching Keller's fortunes rise on the back of a forged estate had left him with any conscience worth appealing to. And she needed, above everything else, to do all of it without Dean Keller learning she had found the room before she was ready for him to know. Because a man who had spent 3 years building a false case with the patience of a chess player was not a man to be given warning. She telephoned Corinne Beatty from the payphone outside the Copper Skillet, because the landline at Aldercroft had not yet been reconnected, and because some part of her, the part that had spent 22 years assuming every phone might one day be relevant to a case, did not want to call on any line that ran through the county exchange nearest Fenwick Hollow. Corinne listened without interrupting for nearly 4 minutes, a long silence for a woman Adele had never once heard go quiet in a year of retainers and motions, and at the end of it she said, in a voice unlike her usual brisk courtroom register, "Adele, do you understand what you are telling me?" Adele said that she did. Corinne said she would drive up herself the following day rather than say another word about it over a diner pay phone, and that Adele should touch nothing, move nothing, and tell no one, including, she said with a pointed gentleness, Mr. Price, until they had spoken properly, face to face, in a room with a door that closed. Gideon noticed anyway, the way he noticed a fence post gone soft or a heifer standing wrong in a field, without being told anything at all. He came up the lane that same afternoon with a load of split ash for the woodbox that Adele had not asked for and did not, on inspection, actually need yet, and he stood in the dooryard turning his cap in his hands and studying her face for a long moment before he said that she looked like a woman who had found something, not lost something, for the first time since he'd met her, and that whatever it was, he wasn't asking, but that if trouble was coming up that lane behind it, she should know. His shotgun had been in that wagoneer's gun rack since before she was born, and he had never once minded using it on something that deserved it. She did not tell him about the room. She told him, which was also entirely true, that she had found some old family papers of Raymond's that changed her understanding of the estate dispute, and that a lawyer was coming, and that she would tell him more when there was more a friend could safely know, and Gideon, who had spent 41 years reading the difference between an animal that needed help and one that needed to be left alone to work a thing out, nodded, and stacked the ash anyway, and left. Corinne arrived the next afternoon in a gray sedan splashed to the door handles with March mud, and Adele walked her down the north hall by lantern light, and watched a woman who had built a career on never being surprised in a conference room stand in the doorway of the vault with her hand pressed flat against her own chest for a full silent minute before she could speak. What followed, over the 2 days Corinne stayed, sleeping in the cedar-scented spare room under 3 wool blankets and complaining not once about the cold, was the construction of a plan built less like a lawsuit and more like the criminal case it had, in fact, become. Corinne's assessment, delivered over coffee at the kitchen table with the green ledger open between them, was blunt in the way Adele had hired her precisely because she could be. The house on Fifth Avenue and the frozen accounts were, in light of what the vault contained, a rounding error, and pursuing them through the Surrogate's court, litigating forged signatures against a corrupt notary's seal in a civil proceeding that could run 3 more years, was no longer the fight worth having. The gold changed the entire shape of the matter, because embezzlement on the scale Raymond's ledger documented, laundered through shell companies and a phantom Zurich dealer, was not a probate question at all. It was a matter for the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the New York State Attorney General's office. And once that machinery began turning, the forged notes that had stripped Adele of her house would very likely turn out to be exactly what they were, which was one more piece of the same fraud, prosecutable in its own right, because a forged loan instrument used to seize a widow's home was not a civil dispute. It was a felony, and Corinne intended to make sure it was charged as one. The question of the gold itself, what it was, whether it was what Raymond's ledger claimed it was, and how in the world a private citizen went about having $445 million of bullion authenticated without alerting the one man in the world most dangerous to alert, occupied the whole of their second morning together. It was Adele, in the end, who remembered the name on the back of a business card given to her 20 years earlier by a stooped man in a gray cardigan, a card she had kept out of nothing more than a widow's sentiment and had packed, without thinking, into the same box as her mother's cigar box and the graded dime, because it had been in the same kitchen drawer for 2 decades, and some things simply travel with a life whether or not they are ever used again. Raymond had told her, the very first day she met him, to get 3 opinions on the dime, one of them from a dealer who disliked him personally, because a man who disliked you had no reason to flatter you. The name on the card was Emery Standish, and the shop, when Corinne located it through a numismatic trade directory, was still operating 3 states away in Hartford, under the same name, run now by Standish's son, but with the old man, 81 years old and sharp as a fresh-cut key, still coming in 3 mornings a week. Emery Standish remembered Raymond Voss the way old rivals remember each other, which was completely, and when Corinne telephoned him from a booth in Utica and explained, in the careful minimum a lawyer allows herself over a line she does not control, that Raymond's widow had come into a quantity of bullion of uncertain but very large value and needed a discreet, independent, unimpeachable authentication. The old man was silent for a moment and then said that Ray Voss had never in 40 years let a bad grade pass his counter, and that he would drive out himself, on a Sunday when the roads were empty and nobody who mattered would notice one more car on Route 20, and that he would bring his own assay kit and his own witness, because a man his age understood that some findings needed 2 sets of eyes attached to 2 names that could not be bought. He came on the 2nd Sunday of March, 70 years old the year Adele had first walked into his shop with a cigar box and now 81, driving himself in a Lincoln that had seen better decades, with a retired assayer named Halloran riding shotgun, a heavy-set silent man who had spent 30 years certifying bullion for a refinery in Providence before retiring and who Standish introduced only as the second set of eyes. The 2 of them spent the better part of 6 hours in the vault, working with the deliberate, unhurried thoroughness of men who had built their whole reputations on never once being wrong in a way that mattered, drawing samples from crates scattered through both banks of shelving rather than trusting any single one, running fire assays on a portable kit Halloran set up on the oak desk with the patience of a man performing surgery, cross-checking serial numbers against refiner registries on a laptop that ran off the same battery bank Raymond had installed for exactly such a purpose, and weighing again, and weighing a 3rd time, because Standish said, more than once, that he had learned from Ray Voss himself never to trust the first number a scale gave you on a day when your hands wanted a particular answer. What they found, when Standish finally sat down at the kitchen table with Adele and Corinne that evening, a man plainly exhausted and plainly moved, was that Raymond's own ledger had been, as everyone who had ever done business with him would have expected, conservative rather than inflated. The bullion was genuine, refined by 4 different houses over a span of decades, entirely consistent with a private collector converting liquid wealth into physical gold in stages across years rather than in one suspicious transaction, and every serial number Standish and Halloran could check against public refiner records checked clean, with no flag, no report of theft, no association with any conflict mineral registry or sanctioned entity, because Raymond Voss, even in his last desperate act, had done the thing honestly, buying legally through licensed brokers with funds that were entirely his own, taxed as income decades earlier when he first earned it, and taxed again, properly, at the time of each purchase, a paper trail so clean that Standish said, shaking his head over his coffee, that it was the single most infuriating thing about the whole find, because a man that careful had made it impossible for anyone ever to credibly claim the fortune was anything but exactly what it appeared to be. At current market weight and purity, Standish's figure arrived at independently and without ever having seen Raymond's own ledger total until after he wrote his own number on a legal pad and turned it around to face her, came to $445 million. Give or take a margin so small, it did not change a single decision Adele would go on to make. She sat with that number for a long time after Standish and Halloran had gone back down the mud-rutted lane in the dark, Corinne beside her at the kitchen table saying nothing, letting the silence do what silence sometimes does better than any words a lawyer could offer. $445 million did not feel, sitting there in Nell Price's boots in a farmhouse with no working furnace, like triumph. It felt like the largest and loneliest fact she had ever been handed, because every dollar of it had been earned and hidden and defended by a man who had spent the final months of his life unable to tell his own wife the truth for fear of what the truth would cost her. And there was no total on any ledger, however many zeros it carried, that could sit across the breakfast table from her again or read Gibbon aloud on a winter evening or call her by the name no one else had ever used. She understood, turning Standish's legal pad slowly under the lamp, that the fortune was real and the fortune was also, in the way that mattered most, beside the point, and that what she actually wanted from the $445 million now sitting in her husband's grandfather's vault was not the money itself, but the specific, exact, and total ruin of the man who had tried to take everything else from her, while Raymond was too weak to stop him. Vernon Sipes proved easier to find than Corinne had expected and harder to talk to than either of them had hoped. He still lived in the same low ranch house on the edge of Saratoga Springs he had occupied for the whole 9 years he'd kept books for the firm, and when Corinne, working alone and identifying herself only as an attorney with questions about an estate matter, knocked on his door on a gray afternoon in the third week of March, the man who answered looked, she reported back to Adele that evening, like someone who had been waiting 4 months for exactly this knock and had spent every one of those months hoping it would never come. He would not let her pass the storm door. He would not confirm or deny that he had notarized anything he believed to be improper. But when Corinne, choosing her words with the precision of a woman who had spent a career learning exactly how much truth to offer a frightened witness, mentioned that she represented Adele Voss, and that Adele had found certain papers of her late husband's that touched on debts Vernon himself owed to Dean Keller, the small damp-palmed bookkeeper went the color of old paper and asked, in a voice barely above the sound of the wind, whether the judge was going to have him arrested. Corinne told him, truthfully, that she could not promise him anything, but that a man who came forward now, on his own, with what he actually knew, was in a very different position than a man who waited to be found, and she left her card, and drove away, and for 6 days heard nothing at all. Dean Keller, meanwhile, had not been idle, and the shape of his impatience reached Aldercroft first through Gideon and then, more directly, through the lane itself. The gray Tahoe returned to the copper skillet twice more in the same week Standish came out to the vault, and on the second visit the man behind the wheel, whom Doreen described afterward as polite in the particular oily way that made her want to check her purse, did not merely ask questions at the counter, but drove the full length of the county road past the mailbox on the cedar post, slow, twice, in both directions. The kind of pass a man makes when he is not lost, but is counting something. A chimney smoke, a car in a dooryard, a light in a window at an hour when a supposedly empty farmhouse ought to have shown none. Gideon caught the second pass himself, from his own porch, and was in his wagoneer and idling at the top of Adele's lane inside for minutes. Not blocking the road exactly, he would say later, just present, the way a good dog is present at a gate without ever once growling. And the Tahoe, seeing him, did not stop and did not come back that day. 2 nights after that, on a night with no moon and a wind hard enough to cover the sound of a footstep, Adele woke in the cold hour before dawn to a noise from the direction of the woodshed that was not the ordinary settling of an old house, and was not, she was certain, even half asleep, an animal. She lay still in the dark for a long moment, doing the arithmetic of an old judge who had once presided over cases involving exactly this kind of hour, and then she rose without a sound and went to the kitchen window without lighting a lamp, and saw, in the gray edge of starlight, a beam of flashlight moving low and careful along the base of the north wall, exactly along the line, she understood with a cold that had nothing to do with March, of the sealed window that marked the outside edge of the vault. Whoever held the light knew, or suspected, precisely where to look, which meant that Raymond's freight receipt or Keller's own memory of some earlier visit, one he was out that way once, years ago, had told him. More than a casual glance at a boarded-up farmhouse ever could. She did not go outside. She telephoned no one, because there was no phone yet to telephone with. She stood at the dark window with her mother's kettle in one hand for a weapon she prayed she would not need, and watched the light move once more along the wall and then wink out, and heard, some minutes later, the distant sound of an engine starting far enough down the county road that it had been left, deliberately, out of earshot of the house. And she stood at that window until the sky went from black to gray to the pale hard blue of a Madison County dawn, and understood that whatever grace period her isolation and Raymond's caution had bought her was now over, and that Dean Keller, however he had come by his suspicion, no longer merely wondered what Aldercroft held. He had come, in the dark, to look for himself, and a man who came once in the dark would come again, and next time he would not come alone. She told Corinne everything the moment the lawyer's car came up the lane the following morning, and Corinne, who had built her whole career on moving carefully, said for the first time since Adele had hired her that careful was no longer the priority, that a man circling a property in the dark before dawn was a man who had stopped being merely a fraud case and become, in the plain language of the law, a trespasser building towards something worse, and that the time for state agencies and quiet document review had passed. She placed a call that same afternoon, not to the Segget's court or the state attorney general's civil division, but to an agent she had worked with years earlier on a separate matter, in the white-collar crimes unit of the FBI's Albany field office, a woman named Rosalind Achterberg, whose reputation, Corinne said, was for moving fast once she was convinced, and for being very hard to convince. Achterberg listened over the phone for the better part of an hour without committing to anything beyond a meeting. And the meeting she set was not in Albany and not at Aldercroft, but in a diner off the interstate in Utica, neutral ground, 2 days out. And she asked Corinne to bring, in her words, everything: the ledger, the assay results, the freight receipt, Vernon Sipes's unfinished letter, all of it, because a case built on a dead man's private notes and an old widow's word would need every ounce of physical corroboration it could carry into a federal courtroom. Adele spent those 2 days doing the only thing that had ever steadied her in a lifetime of waiting for verdicts, which was preparing. She and Corinne copied the green ledger page by page on a portable machine run off the battery bank, sealing the originals in a strongbox Gideon produced without being asked, and without asking a single question about its contents, because he had decided, in his own unhurried way, that whatever was coming up that lane deserved to find the stock already in the barn. She wrote out, in her own hand, a chronology of everything that had happened since the reading of Raymond's will, dated and precise. The discipline of 22 years on the bench turned at last toward her own defense rather than someone else's. And on the evening before she and Corinne were to drive to Utica, standing once more in the cold electric light of the vault with the green ledger closed on the desk in front of her, Adele Voss understood that she was no longer merely a widow trying to hold on to what her husband had left her. She was, for the first time since a stooped man in a gray cardigan had told her the truth about a cigar box 20 years before, sitting once again on the side of a case where the facts, however long buried, were entirely and unshakably hers, and that Dean Keller, circling her fence line in the dark with a flashlight and a growing sense that his own carefully built fraud was about to come apart in his hands, had no idea yet exactly how much the woman he had tried to bury in paper had already found, and had already written down, and was already, at that very moment, driving 300 miles to place directly in front of the one kind of authority in the entire United States that his money could not touch, his lawyers could not delay, and his forged signatures could never explain away. Vernon Sipes called Curran's office on the 6th day, not with the strangled reluctance of their first meeting, but in the flat, exhausted voice of a man who had run out of road. He asked to meet somewhere that was not his house and not her office, and he chose, of all places, the parking lot of a supermarket on the edge of Saratoga Springs at 7 in the morning, sitting in his own car with the windows cracked. And when Corinne slid into the passenger seat, he did not look at her at all, only at his hands on the wheel. And he talked for 40 minutes without stopping, the way a man talks when he has been carrying something so long that once the first sentence is out, the rest simply falls after it. He told her about the gambling debts that had put him, 3 years earlier, so far underwater to a private lender that Dean Keller himself had bought the paper without a word to anyone, and how Keller had never once threatened him outright, had simply mentioned, on slow afternoons at the shop, how easy it would be for a man in Vernon's position to lose everything, his house, his pension, his standing at the church where his wife still did not know a fraction of what he owed. He told her how the notarizations had started small, a signature witnessed after the fact on a document he was assured Raymond had already seen and approved, and how each small compromise had made the next one easier to swallow and harder to refuse, until the morning Keller placed 4 promissory notes in front of him with Raymond Voss's signature already on them. A signature Vernon knew in his bones had never been made in his presence, and Keller had simply looked at him and said that the debt would be considered paid in full the moment the seal went on, and Vernon Sipes, God forgive him, he said, his voice finally breaking in the gray morning light of a supermarket lot, had picked up the stamp. He had the unfinished letter to Raymond, the one from the back of the green ledger, memorized nearly word for word, because he told Corinne he had tried 4 separate times over those final months to finish it and mail it, and had lost his nerve every single time, telling himself there would be another chance, another week, and then Raymond had died and the chance had seemed to die with him, until a lawyer he had never met knocked on his door and told him the widow had found what he'd left behind. He agreed, before Corinne had even finished asking, to give a full statement to whatever authority she named, on the record, under his own name. And he asked only one thing in return, not leniency, not money, but that someone tell Adele Voss directly, from him, that he was sorry, that he had known Raymond Voss for 9 years and had never once known him to do a dishonest thing in his life, and that the two of them, Vernon and Raymond both, had been made instruments of Dean Keller's greed in different ways, one through fear and one through love, and that Vernon understood which of those was the more forgivable and knew it was not his own. Corinne carried that message back to Aldercroft that same evening, relaying it across the kitchen table while the fire ticked in the stove, and Adele listened to all of it in silence, and then said only that she had spent 22 years learning that very few people were made of one single piece, that most men who did terrible things had also, somewhere, done a decent one, and that if Vernon Sipes was finally willing to stand up in a room and tell the truth about what frightened him into wrongdoing, she would not be the one to tell him his sorrow came too late to matter. It was, Corinne thought, watching her client sit very straight in a farmhouse chair in a house that held $445 million behind a hidden door and a dead husband's whole unfinished case for justice. Exactly the kind of thing a judge would say, and exactly the kind of thing, she suspected, that had made Raymond Voss fall in love with her in the first place, 20 years before, over a cigar box and a single valuable dime. The morning of the drive to Utica came in hard and bright after a night of wind, the kind of clear March cold that makes every fence line and bare branch stand out sharp against the sky, and Adele dressed for it the way she had once dressed for the bench, not in Nell Price's borrowed boots and a farmwife's flannel, but in the gray wool suit she had packed on a whim back in January, telling herself even then that a woman never entirely stops being who she was, whatever a courtroom of strangers decided to take from her. Gideon insisted on driving them partway, following the Buick in his tomato-red Wagoneer as far as the county line, entirely on his own initiative. Standing in the frost-white dooryard with his cap already on, he said only that some errands went better with a second vehicle behind them, and that he had a feeling about this particular Tuesday he did not care to explain further, and Adele, who had learned in 6 weeks not to argue with Gideon Price's feelings about a road, simply thanked him and got in the car. They saw the gray Tahoe twice on the drive down, once idling at a gas station outside Richfield Springs in a way that might have meant nothing at all, and once, unmistakably, two vehicles back on the entrance ramp to the interstate outside Herkimer, close enough that Corinne, watching the mirror with the flat concentration of a woman doing math in her head, said, low, that it was either the worst coincidence of the entire ordeal or it was exactly what it looked like, which was a man who had lost patience with waiting to find out what his flashlight in the dark had actually been circling, and had decided to see for himself where the widow of Raymond Voss was going on a Tuesday morning in a suit she had not worn in 4 months. Gideon peeled off at the county line as planned, but not before easing the Wagoneer alongside the Tahoe for the length of a quarter-mile, close enough that whoever sat behind that tinted glass would have had a very clear look at an old farmer in a wool cap watching him without blinking, and the Tahoe, after that quarter-mile, dropped back and did not reappear again before the Utica exit. The diner Rosalind Achterberg had chosen sat off the interstate behind a gas station, a low brick building with a neon sign missing its middle letter and a parking lot half full of long-haul trucks. And Achterberg herself was already in the back booth when Adele and Corinne came through the door, a tall woman in her 50s with steel-colored hair cut close and the stillness of someone who had spent a career learning to let other people fill silences first. She did not stand when they sat down. She did not offer coffee or small talk. She simply looked at the strongbox Corinne set on the table between them, and then at Adele, for a long, unhurried moment. The particular look Adele recognized from the other side of her own bench for 22 years, the look of someone deciding, before a single document was opened, whether the person across the table was telling the truth or merely believed she was. Mrs. Voss, Achterberg said finally, Ms. Beatty tells me you were a judge for over 2 decades before any of this happened to you. Adele said that she was. Achterberg nodded once, slowly, as if filing that fact into a drawer that mattered, and reached across the table, and opened the strongbox herself, and lifted out the green ledger, and began, without another word of preamble, to read. She read for a long time, longer than Adele had expected, turning each page with the same unhurried care Emery Standish had shown weighing a bar of gold, and twice she stopped entirely, and went back several pages, cross-checking a date against something she had already read, the habit of a woman who had built a career on the specific danger of accepting a good story before testing whether its dates could survive contact with each other. She did not react visibly to the $445 million figure at the foot of the inventory pages, which told Adele, who had spent 22 years reading the faces of people determined not to react, that Achterberg had already heard the number from Corinne over the telephone and had spent 2 days deciding, privately, whether to believe it before ever agreeing to this booth. What made her set the ledger down at last, both hands flat on its cover exactly as Adele had set her own hands on it that first cold morning in the vault, was the second section, the one headed simply Dean, and when she finally looked up her stillness had not broken but had narrowed, focused, the way a hawk's stillness narrows the instant before it moves. This is not a probate matter, Achterberg said, and there was no question in it. This is a documented, multi-year securities and wire fraud scheme with a forged instrument used to seize a private residence, corroborated by physical bullion of verified provenance and a cooperating witness willing to testify to his own notarial malfeasance. She looked at Adele for another long moment, and something in her face, not warmth exactly, but a kind of professional respect that Adele recognized because she had spent a career extending it sparingly herself, came into it. Your husband built the entire case before he died, she said. He just needed someone with the standing and the patience to find it. I don't think it's an accident that it turned out to be you. She asked. Then, the questions Adele had known were coming and had rehearsed answers to on the drive down, about the timeline of the discovery, about who else knew, about whether Dean Keller had any reason to suspect how far the investigation had already traveled beyond his reach. Adele told her about the flashlight along the north wall in the dark hour before dawn, and about the Tahoe on the entrance ramp outside Herkimer, and Achterberg's stillness narrowed further still, the way a hand narrows around a tool it has decided to use. A man who is watching a farmhouse in the dark and following a widow's car onto an interstate is a man who believes he is running out of time, she said, and a man who believes that tends to make mistakes a patient one never would. That works in our favor, provided nothing happens to you or to that vault before we can move. She closed the green ledger and set both hands flat on its cover, the third person now in 5 days to make that same unconscious gesture over the same book, as though the weight of what it contained demanded to be physically held down. "I will need everything in this box copied and logged by this afternoon," she said, "and I will need to see the property myself, and soon, because a case this large does not stay contained by luck alone, and luck, Mrs. Voss, appears to be a resource you have very nearly used up already." Outside the window behind her, in the gray morning light of a truck stop parking lot 300 miles from a locked oak door in the hills of Madison County, a gray Tahoe with Saratoga County plates pulled in off the interstate ramp, drove once, slowly, past the diner's front window, and did not stop. Rosalind Achterberg did not waste the week that followed the diner in Utica, and Adele, watching from the strange sideline vantage of a woman who had spent her whole career inside the machinery of the law and now stood entirely outside it, understood within days that she had handed her husband's case to someone who moved the way Raymond himself had once moved across a glass counter, unhurried on the surface and exact underneath. Achterberg drove out to Aldercroft herself on the second day, alone, in an unmarked sedan, and spent 4 hours in the vault with a forensic accountant named Priya Chandrasekharan, who photographed every crate, cross-referenced every stencil number against the green ledger, and left with a portable hard drive of images and a promise, kept to the letter, that nothing would move from that room until a judge had signed the paper making its custody official. A federal magistrate in Albany, presented on the 4th day with Raymond's ledger, Standish's assay report, and a sworn statement from Vernon Sipes that ran to 11 pages and held together under Achterberg's own follow-up questioning without a single contradiction, signed search warrants for the offices of Voss and Keller Rare Coin and Bullion, for the storage facility in Utica leased under Keller Numismatic Holdings, and for Dean Keller's own house on North Broadway, a Georgian brick place, with boxwood hedges that Adele had been inside exactly twice in 18 years of marriage and had never once liked. The warrants executed on a Thursday morning in early April, and Adele learned the details only afterward, secondhand, from Achterberg over a telephone that had finally been reconnected at Aldercroft that same week, the timing of it feeling to her like one more small mercy arriving exactly when it was needed and not 1 hour before. Agents found, in a locked drawer of Keller's home office, a second set of books kept entirely apart from the firm's official ledgers, recording in his own private shorthand nearly 4 years of diverted consignments and phantom Zurich invoices, a document so damning in its specificity that Achterberg said afterward it read less like a fraud and more like a confession Keller had written for no one but himself, the way some men cannot help but keep score even on their own crimes. They found, in the storage unit in Utica, 11 crates of coins and small bullion that Keller had never declared to the partnership at all, diverted inventory kept off every book he ever showed anyone, worth, by Priya Chandrasekharan's later count, just past $3 million, a sum that would have seemed enormous to Adele 4 weeks earlier and now sat almost as a footnote beside the vault at Aldercroft. And they found, taped to the underside of a desk drawer at the shop itself, in an envelope Keller had apparently judged too dangerous to keep anywhere his own home might one day be searched, the original blank notarial stamps and a practice sheet of Raymond Voss's signature, dozens of attempts in Keller's own hand, each one closer to the real thing than the last. The visible record of a man teaching himself to forge his dying partners, name one patient afternoon at a time. Keller was not arrested that Thursday. Achterberg had explained to Adele beforehand, in the flat, unsentimental language of someone who had done this many times, that a case of this size was built in layers, evidence first, then interviews, then the arrest itself timed to prevent flight or destruction rather than to satisfy anyone's appetite for a dramatic morning, and that Keller, questioned briefly and released pending further investigation, a lawyer already beside him inside the hour, would spend the coming days believing, wrongly, that he had more room to maneuver than he actually possessed. What Achterberg did not fully anticipate, and told Adele afterward she should have, was how a cornered man with Dean Keller's particular vanity would choose to spend that room. He came to Aldercroft himself, on the 9th day after the search warrants, in the middle of a soft gray afternoon with rain threatening off the western ridge, driving not the gray Tahoe, which Adele would later learn belonged to a private investigator he had hired months earlier, and had by then let go without a word, but his own car. The same low silver German sedan she remembered from Broadway in the slush of a February afternoon that felt, from where she now stood, like it belonged to another woman's life entirely. Gideon saw the car turn up the lane before Adele did, from his own porch a half-mile down the hill, and was in the Wagoneer and idling at the top of her lane again in 5 minutes. This time in plain sight of the gravel turnaround rather than merely near it, the shotgun laid across the seat beside him where anyone glancing his way could see it and draw their own conclusions. Adele met Keller on the porch because she had decided somewhere in the previous week, turning the question over in the quiet of the vault, that she would not receive him in the kitchen and would not receive him inside the house at all, that whatever this final conversation turned out to be, it would happen in the open, on ground she now owned outright and free of any claim he had ever tried to place on it. He climbed out of the car looking, for the first time in the whole of the ordeal, genuinely diminished, the silver at his temples no longer photographing well, but simply gray, his charcoal overcoat wrinkled as though he had slept in it or not slept at all, and he stood at the base of the porch steps for a long moment looking up at her the way a man looks up at a bench from a witness stand, before he said, in a voice that had lost every trace of its old fluent warmth, that he supposed she knew everything by now. "I know what my husband left me to know," Adele said. "I imagine the federal government knows a good deal more." Keller flinched at the word federal the way she had once watched 100 witnesses flinch at a word they had been dreading and hoping, against all reason, never to hear spoken aloud in a room that mattered. He came up 2 of the porch steps, no farther, some old instinct or Gideon's idling Wagoneer keeping him from closing the distance completely, and he said that he had not come to threaten her, that he wanted her to understand it had never been about her, that Raymond had built something Keller had spent his whole career watching other men be handed for nothing while he worked twice as hard for half the credit, and that somewhere in there the wanting had simply gotten away from him, the way, he said, it gets away from anyone. And Adele, standing on a porch her husband's grandfather had built to outlast exactly this kind of unraveling, found that she had nothing left in her for the speech at all, neither anger nor pity, only the flat, clear exhaustion of a woman who had heard every variety of a guilty man's explanation for 22 years and had never once found one that changed the facts of the case. "You rated a dying man's signature at his own desk while I made him tea in the next room," she said. "You do not owe me an accounting of your feelings about it. You owe the state of New York and the government of the United States an accounting of the money, and I expect you will be giving it to them very soon, in a room considerably less comfortable than this porch." She looked past him, down the lane, to where the rain was finally beginning to cross the ridge in a gray moving curtain, and she said that he should go home now, and that if he had any decency left in him at all, whatever measure of it survived the last several years, he would use these final days of freedom to make things easier for Vernon Sipes rather than harder, because Vernon had already told the truth and Vernon's family did not deserve to suffer for a debt Keller himself had engineered. Keller stood on the step a moment longer, and something crossed his face that might, in another man, have been shame, and then he turned without another word and walked back down through the gathering rain to his car and drove away down the lane past Gideon's idling Wagoneer, and Adele watched from the porch until the silver car had dropped over the rise and out of sight, and only then did she let herself sit down on the top step, in the cold rain beginning to reach even the porch roof, and put her face in her hands, not in grief this time, but in the particular bone-deep release of a woman who has just watched the last of something terrible walk itself off her land. Dean Keller was arrested 6 days later, on a Wednesday morning, at the shop on Broadway, by agents who had waited until the store had opened and a single elderly customer had been gently asked to step back outside before the handcuffs came out. A small courtesy Achterberg told Adele had been entirely her own idea, because she had spent enough years watching men like Keller perform their humiliation for an audience, and had decided this one would not get the satisfaction. He was charged, in an indictment that ran to more than 40 counts, with wire fraud, securities fraud, forgery in the second degree, and grand larceny in the first degree, the last charge tied directly and specifically to the promissory notes used to seize the house on Fifth Avenue, exactly as Corinne had predicted in a farmhouse kitchen weeks before anyone else believed the civil dispute could ever become a criminal one. Vernon Sipes was charged as well, with a single count of notarial fraud, a plea agreement already negotiated in the weeks before the arrest in exchange for his full cooperation, and Adele, reading the indictment Corinne brought out to the farmhouse and laid on the same kitchen table where the green ledger had first been opened for a lawyer's eyes, found herself feeling something for Vernon that surprised her, a species of sorrow that had nothing to do with excusing what he had done and everything to do with recognizing, the way a judge learns to recognize after enough years on a bench, that fear and greed rarely announce themselves as separate things in the same man, and that Vernon Sipes, whatever else he had been, had at least in the end chosen to stop being afraid. The bail hearing, held in the federal courthouse in Albany on a raw morning in the middle of April, was the first time Adele had seen Dean Keller since the rain on her porch, and she sat in the gallery beside Corinne and watched a man who had once filled a room with borrowed warmth stand small and gray before a magistrate who set his bail at an amount high enough, given the flight risk a passport and offshore holding companies presented, that Keller's own attorney visibly blanched reading the figure aloud. He made bail within the week, his family posting the Georgian house on North Broadway itself as collateral, a detail the Saratogan reported with a headline considerably less sympathetic than the one it had run 4 months earlier about the entangled retired judge, because newspapers, Adele had learned over a long career of being written about from the bench rather than in the dock, followed the direction of the wind with a speed that would embarrass a weather vane. The same reporter who had once printed Keller's account of a great man's quiet mistakes at length beside a flattering photograph now wrote a second story, considerably longer, headlined Forged Fortune, that laid out the scheme in careful, sourced, unflinching detail, quoting Rosalind Achterberg's office at length and Adele Voss not at all, because Corinne had advised, correctly, that anything Adele said publicly before the trial would be turned over word by word to Keller's defense, and Adele, who understood the discipline of silence better than almost anyone in the state, said nothing to any reporter for the whole of the 11 months that followed. Those 11 months held a peculiar suspended quality, neither the raw survival of the first winter nor the vindication that had not yet fully arrived, and Adele filled them the way she had always filled the waiting stretches of a working life, with method. Corinne, working now in close coordination with Achterberg's office and with a civil attorney she brought in specifically to handle it, filed to have the fraudulent promissory notes voided as instruments obtained through forgery, a motion that, once the criminal indictment existed as a matter of public record, moved through the Sigget's court with a speed that would have astonished the Adele of the previous November, who had once been told by Walter Pruitt that such matters could run years. The house on Fifth Avenue, still held by the partnership's successor entity pending the outcome of the criminal case, was returned to her outright in the autumn, the deed transfer recorded on a bright cold morning that Adele marked by driving the 3 hours back to Saratoga alone, letting herself in the front door with her own key for the first time in the better part of a year, and standing in the front hall of a house that smelled faintly of dust and someone else's cleaning solvent, feeling far less than she had expected to feel, because the house, it turned out, once emptied of the particular danger of losing it, was only a house, handsome and familiar and no longer, in any way that mattered to her chest, the center of anything. Aldercroft had become that instead, without her quite deciding it, somewhere in the space of a hard winter and a harder spring. The trial began the following March, almost exactly a year to the week after Adele had first turned a bronze wheel by lantern light, and it lasted 11 days in a federal courtroom in Albany that Adele attended in full, every session, seated in the gallery in the same gray wool suit she had worn to the diner in Utica, because Corinne had told her that a jury noticed who came and who did not, and Adele, retired judge that she was, had no intention of letting Dean Keller's defense suggest to 12 strangers that the widow at the center of this case could not be bothered to witness her own vindication. The government's case, built on the foundation Raymond had laid in a locked room and the corroboration Achterberg's team had spent a year assembling on top of it, was, in the plain professional judgment Adele could not help forming even from the wrong side of the bench, close to unassailable. Emery Standish testified for the better part of a day about the authentication of the bullion, dry and precise, and utterly unshakable under cross-examination, an 81-year-old man who had clearly decided this would be the last great professional performance of his life, and delivered it accordingly. Priya Chandrasekharan walked the jury through the shell companies and the phantom Zurich invoices with a series of exhibits so clear that even the jurors who had confessed during selection to finding financial testimony tedious were seen leaning forward. And Vernon Sipes, called by the prosecution under the terms of his own plea agreement, sat in the witness box for the better part of 2 days and told the truth in the same flat, exhausted voice he had used in a supermarket parking lot the previous spring, admitting to every notarization, every fear that had driven him to make it, and every month he had spent afterward unable to look at his own wife across their kitchen table. And when Keller's attorney tried, on cross-examination, to paint him as a man inventing testimony to save himself, Vernon looked at the jury and said, simply, that he wished to God he had something to invent instead of what actually happened, because the truth was a great deal harder to live with than a lie would have been. And Adele watched 3 jurors write that sentence down word for word. Adele herself testified on the 7th day, called not to establish the fraud, which by then the documents and the accountants had done more thoroughly than any widow's memory could, but to speak to the last months of Raymond's life, the tremor in his hands, the closed study door, the letter she had found sewn into the spine of a law book he had given her 16 years before he ever needed it to carry a secret. She spoke for 40 minutes without notes, the discipline of a career spent never once needing to read from a page. And when the government's attorney asked her, near the end, what it had felt like to understand, standing in a hidden vault at 4 in the morning, exactly what her husband had done and why he had never told her, she was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the courtroom itself seemed to lean in with the jury. And then she said that it had felt like the last and truest conversation of an 18-year marriage, conducted entirely without words, and that she did not expect the jury to understand grief of that particular shape, because she was not certain she fully understood it herself, only that she had spent every day since trying to be worthy of the trust a dying man had placed in a locked door and a 5-letter word on a bronze wheel. The jury deliberated for a day and a half and returned convictions on 38 of the 41 counts against Dean Keller, acquitting on 3 technical securities charges the prosecution had always considered its weakest, a result Achterberg called, privately, over coffee with Adele and Corinne on the courthouse steps, about as complete a victory as the government had any right to expect. Sentencing came 6 weeks later, and the courtroom was fuller than it had been for any single day of the trial itself, word having traveled through Saratoga and beyond it that the reckoning was finally arriving, and Adele sat once more in the gallery in her gray suit, this time with Gideon Price beside her, having driven up from Fenwick Hollow the night before in his tomato-red Wagoneer and taken a room at the same inn on Broadway where, on a very different afternoon the previous winter, Corinne had first laid out for her exactly how long a probate fight could run. The judge, a stern silver-haired woman named Halloway who had clearly read every page of the pre-sentence report, allowed victim impact statements before she spoke, and Adele, invited to address the court, declined, having decided weeks earlier that she had already said everything she needed to say from the witness box and did not intend to give Dean Keller the theater of watching her weep in front of a room a second time. It was, instead, a retired employee of the partnership, a woman named Cheryl Antonetti who had kept the books before Vernon Sipes and had spent 11 years of her pension steadily eroded by transactions she never had reason to question, who stood and told the court in a plain, unpracticed voice what it had felt like to plan a retirement around numbers that turned out, in the end, to have been partly fiction. And Adele watched Keller's face while Cheryl Antonetti spoke and saw, for the only time in the whole proceeding, something that might genuinely have been shame rather than performance. Judge Halloway addressed Keller directly before pronouncing sentence, noting for the record that the defendant had not merely stolen from a business partner, but had exploited that partner's declining health and devotion to his wife to construct a fraud so calculated it bore the hallmarks less of a moment's weakness than of years of patient design, a scheme that had reached, in its final and cruelest turn, into the pension accounts of employees who had trusted him with the ordinary arithmetic of their old age, and she sentenced him to 22 years in federal prison, 1 year, Adele noted without ever saying so aloud to anyone, for every year of her marriage to Raymond Voss. Saratoga Springs, which had spent one long winter watching a disgraced widow lose her home in an orderly courtroom proceeding and had found the spectacle, if Adele was honest with herself, rather more entertaining than tragic, now performed its reversal with the same efficient lack of self-awareness it had brought to the original judgment. The Saratogen ran the conviction on its front page under a headline that used the word vindicated without apparent irony, alongside a photograph of Adele leaving the courthouse in her gray suit that made her look, she thought, considerably more composed than she had actually felt in that moment. The hospital gala committee, whose members had once told her how brave she was in the specific tone reserved for the contagious, sent a card within the week inviting her to that year's spring benefit as an honored guest, an invitation Corinne read aloud at the kitchen table with an expression somewhere between disbelief and delight, in which Adele declined, politely, in 3 sentences, citing a prior commitment that existed nowhere, but in her own settled refusal to be readmitted to a room that had shown her exactly what it was made of the moment the wind changed direction once already. Maxine Voss, Raymond's cousin, who had remarked at the reading room the previous winter that family was family but Adele had, after all, come along late, and that perhaps the correction was overdue, did not send a card at all, but was reported by more than one mutual acquaintance to have told anyone who would listen that she had never once doubted Adele. A claim so thoroughly and instantly contradicted by a full winter of witnesses that even the acquaintances repeating it did so with an eyebrow raised, and Adele, hearing the story secondhand from Corinne over the telephone, found that she felt nothing at all about Maxine Voss, neither anger nor satisfaction, only the mild, distant amusement of a woman who has learned, at considerable cost, precisely how much a certain kind of good opinion was ever actually worth. What mattered a great deal more to her, in the weeks after the sentencing, was Vernon Sipes. His plea agreement, negotiated in exchange for testimony that had proven decisive at trial, spared him prison entirely in favor of 5 years of probation and a restitution order he would very likely spend the rest of his working life repaying. And when Adele learned that his house, mortgaged to the edge of its value against the very gambling debts that had made him vulnerable to Keller in the first place, was still at genuine risk of foreclosure despite the plea, she did a thing that surprised even Corinne, who by then had come to believe she understood her client fully. She had the debt purchased through a private trust Corinne set up, with instructions that Vernon Sipes never learn the identity of the purchaser, and restructured at terms he could actually meet. And when Corinne asked her, gently, whether she was certain, given everything the man had done, Adele said only that Raymond had once told her every account eventually balanced, one way or another, and that she had decided this was the way she wanted this particular one to close, without a debt owed either direction between herself and a frightened man who had, in the end, chosen the harder truth over the easier lie, at an age when most men had long since stopped being capable of that particular kind of courage. The $445 million itself, once the criminal proceedings concluded and the last question of the estate's disposition passed finally and fully into her own name, presented Adele with a decision she had turned over in her mind through the whole of the trial without ever quite settling it. Because a fortune of that size, she came to understand, sitting alone in the vault some evenings with the desk lamp burning the way Raymond must have sat there so many times before her, was not actually a reward. It was a responsibility Raymond had built and then handed to her without asking whether she wanted it, in the same way he had handed her, without asking, an entire hidden decade of his declining health and his private war against a man he trusted. She spent the better part of a year deciding what to do with it, consulting tax attorneys and a wealth manager Standish recommended with the same care he had brought to authenticating the gold itself, and what she settled on, in the end, was not a single grand gesture but a structure, careful and layered, that felt to her more like the kind of thing a judge builds than the kind of thing a lottery winner spends. She established a foundation in Raymond's name, the Voss Trust for Numismatic Education, funded to endow scholarships for young people studying conservation, appraisal, and the history embedded in ordinary objects, the exact unglamorous discipline Raymond had practiced behind a glass counter for 40 years and had never once been given proper credit for outside a small circle of collectors who understood what honesty in that business actually cost. She paid, in full and without any public announcement, the pension shortfall that Achterberg's investigators had discovered among the partnership's own employees. Workers who had watched their retirement accounts steadily thinned by Keller's diversions for years without any of them ever suspecting the cause. A wrong Adele considered a debt every bit as real as anything owed to her personally, and one considerably easier to settle. She endowed the volunteer fire company that served Fenwick Hollow with a new engine and a repaired firehouse roof, because Gideon mentioned once, offhand, that the old engine had been held together with a stubbornness that outpaced its mechanical soundness, and because Adele had come, over one long winter, to understand that the true measure of a neighbor was not sentiment, but the specific, unglamorous willingness to show up with a chainsaw at the right hour, and she intended for the town that had produced Gideon Price to have equipment worthy of the people who ran into burning buildings for their neighbors. And she kept a portion of it, a sum still larger than she would ever spend in whatever years remained to her, simply as it was, in the vault, in the crates Casper Voss had built his room to protect, because some part of her had decided that the gold belonged there in a way that transcended its market value, that it was, in its heaviness and its dullness and its patient decades of waiting, the single most eloquent thing her husband had ever said to her, and she was not yet ready, and was not sure she ever would be, to let all of it leave the room he had built to hold it. The house itself changed, slowly, over the 2 years that followed, in a way that mirrored, Adele thought more than once, the slower and stranger changes taking place in her. She did not gut it or modernize it beyond recognition, because Aldercroft had never asked to be anything other than what Casper Voss had built it to be, a plain, honest structure engineered by a man who distrusted appearances and trusted mass and mortar instead, and she found, to her own surprise, that she had come to feel the same way herself. She had the roof properly reslated, matching stone sourced from a quarry 2 counties over that still cut in the old dimensions, and she had the porch rebuilt board by a Fenwick Hollow carpenter named Otis Redfern, who took one look at the original joinery and told her, with the particular reverence craftsmen reserved for other craftsmen, that whoever had framed this porch had known exactly what he was doing, and he intended to honor it rather than improve on it. She had electricity brought properly up the lane at last, though she kept the oil lamps filled and ready in every room out of a habit that had stopped being necessity and become something closer to remembrance. She opened the boarded windows one by one, letting light back into rooms that had gone dark before she was ever born, and she left the sealed north window of the vault exactly as Casper had built it, because that one wall, she decided, was allowed to keep its privacy even now that everything behind it had been counted and witnessed and made completely and finally legal. The study door itself, she had a locksmith service and preserve rather than replace. The offset hinges cleaned and reoiled, the bronze wheel of letters polished until it turned under a fingertip with the same smooth click it had given her that first cold morning, and she kept the room behind it not as a working vault any longer, but as something closer to what it had actually always been underneath the gold, which was Raymond's true study, the place where the whole of who he was had finally been, laid out for her to find. She moved his desk chair in from Fifth Avenue, and a shelf of his own books, and the framed photograph from the back of her Blackstone, Casper and the door, October 1938, and she began, in the second spring after the sentencing, to spend an hour there most evenings, not counting money, which by then Priya Chandrasekharan's successor firm handled with a precision Raymond himself would have approved of, but simply sitting, the way she imagined he must have sat there himself on those 3 or 4 visits a year across 2 decades, in the particular silence of a room that had once held a secret and now, its secret told, held only a marriage. Gideon Price came into that second year of her life at Aldercroft the way he had come into the first, sideways and without announcement. One small, unremarkable kindness stacked on another until neither of them could quite say when kindness had become something else. He was at the farmhouse most days by then in some capacity or other, mending a fence, splitting wood he insisted the winters still required even with a working furnace installed, and increasingly, simply sitting at the kitchen table across from her in the evenings with 2 cups of coffee neither of them hurried through, talking about nothing important in the unhurried way of 2 people who had each already lost a spouse and understood, better than most, that the important things did not always need to be said aloud to be true. Neither of them named it for a long while. It was Corinne, Visiting one weekend the autumn after the sentencing and watching Gideon stack the porch chairs against an early frost without being asked while Adele watched him from the kitchen window, with an expression Corinne had never once seen on her client's face across 2 years of retainers and hearings, who finally said, gently, over coffee once he had gone, that a woman was allowed more than one great love in a life, provided she had the courage to recognize the second one when it arrived gently enough not to announce itself as a replacement for the first. Adele thought about that for a long time before she answered, in the particular way she thought about everything that mattered, turning it over the way she had once turned over a 1916 dime under a jeweler's loupe, weighing it from every angle before rendering a verdict. She told Corinne, eventually, that she did not think of Gideon as a replacement for Raymond, and did not think Gideon thought of himself that way either, both of them too old and too honestly grieved to make that particular mistake. What she felt for him, she said, was something with its own shape entirely, built not on the sudden combustion of a courtroom or the 4 decades of patient devotion Raymond had brought to a single dime, and then to her, but on cordwood and plowed lanes and a shotgun laid ready on a truck seat, without a word of explanation needed, on 2 people who had each already survived the worst thing either of them could imagine and had found, against every reasonable expectation of a life that far along. That survival itself could open onto something warm rather than merely onto more survival. She married him the following June, in the dooryard where the goldenrod had once stood dead and now stood green, a small gathering under a tent that Otis Redfern's crew put up in an afternoon, Corinne standing up for her, Standish driving out from Hartford at 83 years old to toast the bride with a glass of champagne he pronounced, after careful consideration, entirely genuine. She still went to Greenridge Cemetery once a year, on the 4th of November, alone, the way she had gone that first bitter afternoon under a sleeting sky, with Dean Keller weeping his practiced tears across an open grave. The stone was simple granite, Raymond's name and his years, and, at Adele's own insistence over the objection of a monument company that wanted to sell her something grander, nothing else at all, because Raymond Voss had spent his whole life distrusting ornamentation and she had not intended to burden his marker with any he would not have chosen for himself. She stood there each November in whatever coat the year's weather demanded, and she told him, in the plain, unhurried way she had once told him about her docket over Sunday eggs, what the year had brought. She told him about the scholarship fund's first graduating class, for young conservators placed in museums and auction houses from Boston to San Francisco, each of them, she told the granite, more careful with an object's history than the last, which she thought would have pleased him more than any single dollar figure ever could. She told him about the pension fund made whole, about Otis Redfern's porch, about Standish's champagne toast, about a wedding under a tent in a dooryard where dead goldenrod once stood, and she told him, every year, without fail, that she had read every page of his ledger the way he had built it to be read, in order, sourced the way a court would demand it be sourced, and that she hoped, wherever a mind as precise as his went when the body finally gave out, that some part of him understood the case had been won. The gala committee never did learn quite what to make of her afterward, an old widow who had rebuilt her whole life around a stone farmhouse 3 hours from the town that had once tried to write her off, who declined every invitation back into the rooms that had abandoned her, and instead, twice a year, opened Aldercroft's own dooryard for a scholarship fundraiser that Standish and Achterberg and even, eventually, a very changed and very chastened Judge Halloway drove out to attend, standing in the same clearing where a tent had once held a wedding, admiring a house that a whole county had once dismissed as a condemned farmhouse worth $41,000 and back taxes. The vault itself she showed to almost no one, in the years that followed, beyond the handful of people who had already earned the right to have seen it during the ordeal itself. She took Gideon down the stone steps only once, on their wedding night, not out of any wish to impress him, because if there was one certainty in the whole of her second marriage it was that Gideon Price could not be impressed by money, but because she had decided he deserved to see, fully and without withholding, the entire strange inheritance he was marrying into, gold and grief, and all of it together. He stood in the cold electric light for a long while, the way everyone who ever saw that room for the first time seemed to need to stand for a long while. And then he said, In the unhurried way, he said everything that mattered, that he had spent 41 years pulling calves and setting bones, and had learned that the value of a thing was mostly a question of what it cost someone to build it, and what it went on to save afterward, and that by his reckoning this room had already saved a good deal, more than its weight in gold, because it had saved her, and it had, in its own roundabout stone-walled way, brought the two of them to a kitchen table together on 100 ordinary evenings that neither of them would otherwise have had, and that struck him as worth considerably more than any number Emery Standish had ever written on a legal pad. Adele thought about that often, in the years that followed, sitting some evenings alone in the study with the desk lamp burning and the bronze wheel of letters catching the light beside the door, turning over the whole shape of what had happened to her the way she had once turned over a case file, looking for the thread that ran under all of it. She had lost, in the space of a single terrible winter, a husband, a house, a marriage's worth of accumulated comfort, and very nearly her own good name in a town that had known her for 2 decades and abandoned her inside of 11 weeks. She had gained, in the slower and stranger accounting that followed, a stone house built by a man who understood that some things are worth protecting behind walls 3 feet thick, a fortune she had never once wanted and had learned, in the end, to use the way Raymond himself would have used it, carefully, in the direction of the people who actually needed it rather than the people who merely expected it. She had gained a neighbor who became a husband without either of them ever quite deciding the exact hour it happened, and a hard-won understanding, earned the only way that particular understanding is ever earned, that the people who show up with a chainsaw and a pot of stew in the worst week of your life tell you a great deal more about the actual shape of the world than any headline in a small-town newspaper ever could. The shop on Broadway, the one with the green awning where a stooped man in a gray cardigan had once told a 49-year-old trial judge the truth about a cigar box, was forfeited to the government as part of Keller's sentence, its assets liquidated to help fund the restitution owed to the partnership's defrauded pension holders. And for the better part of a year after the trial it sat dark behind its own hand-painted sign, the gold lettering that had once read Voss and Keller stripped down, by a court-ordered contractor to bare glass, a storefront on the town's main street standing as its own small silent verdict on everything that had happened inside it. Adele drove past it more than once on trips back to settle the last details of the Fifth Avenue house, and each time she felt less grief than a kind of unfinished business, the sense of a sentence left without its final clause. She bought the building herself, without any announcement, through the same trust that had restructured Vernon Sipes's mortgage, in the spring of the second year, and she spent the summer that followed doing the one thing she found she still wanted from the whole of Raymond's old world, which was to put his name back on the glass, alone this time, no partner beside it, and to reopen the shop not as an investment house chasing the bullion trade Keller had used as his cover, but exactly as it had been in the decades before Keller ever walked through the door, a place where a widow with a cigar box could bring in $90 of ordinary coins and one extraordinary dime and be told the truth about both without being sold anything at all. She could not run it herself, 3 hours away and increasingly disinclined to spend her remaining years behind a glass counter. And so she went looking, through the very scholarship program she had endowed in Raymond's name, for someone who understood that the true inventory of that business had never been the coins themselves, but the honesty brought to grading them. And she found her in a young conservator named Priscilla Aldous, 2 years out of a graduate program in historic preservation, who had grown up 2 towns from Fenwick Hollow and had written, in her scholarship application the previous year, an essay about her own grandmother's coin collection that Adele had read twice before deciding, on the strength of it alone, exactly who deserved the keys to Raymond Voss's shop. Priscilla reopened the doors the following October, the gold lettering fresh and simple, Voss rare coin, nothing more, and Adele drove down for the small quiet opening, standing at the back of a shop she had once known every inch of as a wife rather than an owner, watching a 26-year-old stranger spread a felt cloth across the same glass case and greet the first customer of the new era with the unhurried patient care of someone who had, in some manner Adele could not entirely explain and did not feel any need to, absorb the whole of what the place was actually meant to be. The first customer, as it happened, was an elderly man from Ballston Spa carrying a cigar box of his late father's coins, and Adele, standing unnoticed near the door, Watch Priscilla spread the felt cloth and go through the box piece by piece with a pair of cotton gloves, exactly as Raymond had once done for her, and set one small silver piece apart from the others. And tell the man gently, and without embellishment, that this single coin was worth a very great deal more than everything else in the box combined, and that he should have it graded and insured before he did anything else at all. And Adele felt something settle in her chest that she had been carrying, unnamed, since the morning she first stood in front of that same counter 22 years earlier, the sense of a circle closing exactly where it had opened. She did not stay long after that. She had learned, over 2 strange and transformative years, that some things were better left to run forward on their own once you had set them properly on their course, the way Raymond himself had once set an entire hidden decade in motion and then trusted, without ever quite saying so, that she would be the one to finish it correctly. The second she had marked at Aldercroft since her second marriage, she walked the North Hall alone after Gideon had gone up to bed, carrying the same tin lantern she had carried that first cold March morning, though the house no longer needed it for anything but company. She stood in front of the study door, running her fingers over the bronze wheel the way she had done 100 times since, feeling the letters click under her fingertip in the dark, and she thought, not for the first time, that Raymond Voss had built her a door instead of leaving her a note, because a note could be read once and set aside, and a door turned and opened deliberately, night after night, for the rest of a long life. Asked something of the person who opened it, some renewal of the choice to walk through, and she understood, standing there with her husband's grandfather's stone walls holding the cold at bay all around her, that she would go on making that same choice for as many Novembers as she had left. The gold behind the door had nothing to do with it. The marriage did, the whole unfinished conversation of it, conducted in a lock and a key and a wheel of letters that spelled, every single time she turned it, the one name in the world that had only ever belonged to her. She turned the wheel that night, D-E-L-L-A, and heard, deep in the stone, the old familiar consent, and did not open the door at all, only stood a moment longer in the dark with her hand flat against the oak, and then she banked the lantern, and walked back down the North Hall, past the parlor where the long-case clock had long since been wound and set running again, its hands moving now the way Raymond's own hands had once moved across a Sunday table full of eggs and old coins and stories about hoards sealed in walls before wars and found, generations later, by hands patient enough to go looking. And she climbed the stairs to where Gideon Price lay already asleep in the bed that had once been Caspar Voss's own, and she got in beside him, and let the old house settle around her, stone on stone, the way it had settled for 130 years, and slept. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.